The Grand Assembly Hall felt different when the summit reconvened 3 days later. The seats were arranged in the same circular pattern. The same species occupied the same positions, but something fundamental had changed. Su Min took her place on the platform reserved for minor delegations, but she noticed that the chairs around her were no longer empty delegates. From half a dozen species had moved their seats closer to the human representative. No one had asked permission. No one had made an announcement. They simply sat near her as if it were the most natural thing in the galaxy. Ambassador Thexoran entered the chamber last. He walked slowly, his normally proud posture diminished by exhaustion and something that might have been humility. His family had survived because of the human rescue mission. His wife and children were recovering in the station's medical facilities, alive because strangers from a primitive world had risked everything to save them. He took his place at the central podium, but he did not speak immediately. Instead, he stood in silence, looking around the chamber at the assembled delegates. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than it had been before, quieter, heavier. This summit has witnessed something unprecedented, he said. A species we dismissed as children, a species we mocked and humiliated, chose to sacrifice their own lives for ours. He paused, his compound eyes moving slowly across the room until they found Su Min's 7 human crew members are dead. He continued, 19 more remain in critical care. They knew the danger. Before they launched, they went anyway. I've spent my career believing that power and age and technology were what mattered in this galaxy. I was wrong. Ambassador Thexoran stepped down from the central podium and walked across the chamber floor. Delegates watched in stunned silence as the most powerful diplomat at the summit approached the platform where Su Min sat. He stopped before her and performed a gesture that made the other Velthari delegates gasp aloud. He lowered his head and spread his upper limbs in the posture of deepest respect, a gesture that Velthari reserved only for those they considered their equals or superiors. I mocked you, he said. I called you primitive. I tried to have you expelled from this summit, and when my family was dying, your people came to save them without asking for anything in return. He raised his head and met her eyes. I do not understand why they did this. Su Min rose from her seat. Because they could, she said. Because it was the right thing to do. Because humans do not believe that the strong should abandon the weak. Because every life matters, regardless of what species it belongs to. She looked around the chamber at the hundreds of delegates watching this exchange. We are young, she continued. We are primitive by your standards. Our technology is simple. Our history is brief. And our power in this galaxy is almost nothing, but we have something that cannot be measured by years or weapons or territory. We have compassion. We have the willingness to help others, even when it costs us everything. We have the belief that the universe is better when we take care of each other. She turned back too. Thexoran, you asked why our people did this. Here is my answer. Because this is who we are. This is what humanity means. Not conquest, not domination, not proving that we are stronger or smarter than everyone else. Just the simple truth that when someone needs help, we will be there. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Ambassador Yungtai stood, followed by the Thracian Trade Minister, then the Venakai representative. Then delegate after delegate rising to their feet in a gesture of respect that transcended species and history and ancient grievances. The assembly chairman, who had presided over hundreds of summit sessions across decades of service, wiped moisture from his eyes as he called for order. This summit has witnessed many remarkable things, he said, but nothing has moved me as deeply as what we have seen in the past few days. He turned to address the full assembly. I call for a vote on a motion to grant humanity full partnership status in the Galactic Trade Consortium, effective immediately, bypassing all standard probationary requirements. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in the history of the summit, a new species was granted full partnership, rights by acclamation rather than years of bureaucratic process. Su-Min accepted the honor on behalf of Earth. Her voice steady despite the tears running down her face in the days that followed. The summit accomplished more than it had in years. The multi-party exchange that Su-Min had proposed was approved with modifications that made it even more beneficial to all parties involved. Trade agreements that had been stalled for decades moved forward. Species that had refused to speak to each other began opening diplomatic channels. Something had shifted in the galaxy's political landscape. A small species from an insignificant world had reminded everyone what truly mattered. Not power, not age, not technology, character, compassion, the willingness to sacrifice for others. One standard year later, Su-Min returned to Station Volante 9 as Earth's lead ambassador. She was no longer assigned to the highest tier of seating. Her position was near the center, among the senior delegations, where her voice carried equal weight with species that had been spacefaring for millennia. When new species arrived at the summit, uncertain and intimidated by the ancient powers surrounding them, Su-Min made sure they were welcomed. She remembered what it felt like to be mocked. She remembered what it felt like to stand alone. She made certain that no one would feel that way again. Ambassador Dexorin sought her out on the first day of the new summit. His family had fully recovered, and his youngest daughter had apparently announced her intention to study human languages when she came of age. Humanity has changed this galaxy, he said. When I see your species now, I no longer see primitives or children. I see something that perhaps we have lost over our long years among the stars. I see hope. Su-Min smiled and touched the small crystal pendant she wore around her neck. A gift from a Velthari child who had called humans heroes. We are all still learning, she said. All of us. Regardless of how old our civilizations are, the galaxy is vast and strange and sometimes cruel, but it does not have to be faced alone. She looked out through the observation window at the ships passing by. Vessels from 100 different worlds traveling together through the infinite darkness. Humanity found its place among the stars, not through conquest or technological dominance, but through something far simpler and far more powerful. They found their place by being kind, by being brave, by being willing to help strangers even when the cost was terrible. They earned their place by showing the galaxy what it truly meant to be. Human in the galaxy would never forget a memorial wall near the station's main docking bay. 7 names had been carved in letters of light. Captain Lee Seung-ho and the 4 crew members of the Northern Star, who had given their lives to save strangers, plus 2 more who had died from radiation exposure in the days that followed beneath their names. Inscribed in the languages of every species at the summit was a single phrase. They came for us when no one else would. Su-Min visited the memorial every morning before the summit sessions began. She stood in silence before those names and remembered. Then she turned and walked back into the Grand Assembly Hall, ready to continue the work they had died for, the work of building bridges, the work of finding common ground, the work of proving every single day that humanity was worthy of the place they had earned among the stars, not through power, not through pride, but through love. That was the human way, and it always would be. The situation was worse than the initial report suggested. The Velthari colony ship Eternal Harmony had been carrying over 4,000 passengers when the radiation storm struck. It was a massive vessel, designed for long-distance travel between Velthari worlds. But its shields had been overwhelmed by the unexpected intensity of the storm. Now it drifted dead in space. its engines cold, its protective systems failing, and its passengers slowly dying from radiation exposure. Su-min gathered this information as she made her way to the station's emergency coordination center. Delegates from every species had assembled there, watching the live data feeds with expressions of horror and helplessness. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Valkyrie rescue ships were too far away. Medical vessels from the station could reach the Eternal Harmony in approximately 18 hours. By then, most of the passengers would be dead. The Kalori medical specialists calculated that survivors would begin succumbing to radiation poisoning within 6 hours. After 12 hours, only those in the most heavily shielded compartments would still be alive. After 18 hours, there would be almost no one left to save. Ambassador Dexoran stood at the center of the coordination center, his proud bearing replaced by naked desperation. His wife and 3 children were aboard the Eternal Harmony. They had been traveling to meet him at the summit when the storm struck. There must be something we can do, he demanded, his voice cracking. There must be ships closer than our rescue fleet. The Kalori emergency coordinator shook her head sadly. We have checked every vessel in the sector. None can reach them in time. None except possibly one. Su-min stepped forward. What about human ships? Every eye in the room turned to her. Your ships, Dexoran said, his voice somewhere between disbelief and contempt. Your primitive human vessels. They would be destroyed by the radiation before they reached the Eternal Harmony. Maybe. Su-min said maybe not. She activated a display showing the positions of Earth's merchant fleet in the sector. There were 7 ships within potential range. Small vessels by galactic standards, but equipped with engines designed for speed rather than comfort. Human ships are built differently than yours, she explained. We evolved on a world you call Death World. Our bodies can tolerate radiation levels that would kill most species. Our ships are designed with that in mind. The Kalori coordinator leaned forward. She is correct. Humans have an unusually high resistance to radiation. Their ships carry additional shielding because their crews can survive longer exposure during installation and maintenance. But this is still extremely dangerous, she added. The radiation levels near the Eternal Harmony are severe even by human standards. Su-min nodded. I know. That is why I am asking for volunteers. Not giving orders, she typed a message into her communicator and sent it to every human ship captain in the sector. To all Earth vessels. Valkyrie colony ship in distress. 4,000 passengers dying from radiation exposure. No other ships can reach them in time. Requesting volunteer crews for rescue mission. Extreme danger. High probability of casualties. Respond if willing. She looked up at the assembled delegates. Now we wait. The response came faster than anyone expected. Within 3 minutes, all 7 human captains had answered. Every single one volunteered. Captain Yoon Ji-hoon of the merchant vessel Dauntless was the first to report his ship ready for launch. He was followed by Captain Park Min-young of the Swift Current and Captain Lee Seung-ho of the Northern Star. One by one, the human ships checked in. They understood the danger. They knew the odds. They were going anyway. Dexoran stared at the display showing the human ships accelerating toward his dying family. Why? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why would they do this? Su-min turned to face him. Because they can. She said simply, because it is the right thing to do. Because that is what humans are. The rescue mission launched within the hour. Su-min stayed in the coordination center, monitoring communications and coordinating with the human captains as they raced toward the Eternal Harmony. The journey took 4 hours at maximum acceleration during that time. Su-min did not sit down. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She watched the data streams and talked with the captains and prayed to every god she could name that they would arrive in time. The human ships reached the Eternal Harmony just as the colony ships remaining Power systems began to fail. Radiation levels were worse than predicted. Captain Yoon reported that his crew was already experiencing symptoms of exposure, but they pressed on anyway. The evacuation was brutal and chaotic. Human crews in radiation suits that were never designed for this level of exposure moved through the dying ship, carrying passengers who could not walk, guiding those who could toward the airlocks. They found survivors huddled in emergency shelters, children crying, adults praying, the elderly lying still and accepting their fate. The humans saved them anyway, one by one. The human ships filled beyond their normal capacity. Passengers were packed into cargo holds, corridors, and any available space. Life support systems strained under loads they were never designed to handle. 3 ships suffered severe damage from the radiation. Their shields failed, their systems malfunctioned, and their crews absorbed doses that would have killed most other species in minutes. The crew of the Northern Star made a decision that would be remembered for generations. Their ship's engines were failing, and they could not escape the radiation field with their current load of passengers. Someone had to stay behind and manually operate the failing systems while the others escaped. Captain Lee and 4 of his crew members volunteered. They kept the Northern Star running long enough to transfer their passengers to other vessels. Then the ship went dark in the coordination center. Su-min watched the Northern Star's signal disappear from the display. She did not cry. There would be time for tears later. Right now, there were still people to save. The evacuation continued for 3 more hours. Human crews worked until they collapsed, then got up and worked some more. Medics treated radiation burns with hands that were themselves burned. Engineers kept failing systems, running through sheer determination and creative profanity. When it was over, more than 3,000 passengers from the Eternal Harmony had been transferred to the human vessels. Over 700 could not be saved, their radiation exposure too severe. By the time the rescue ships arrived, but 3,000 people who should have died were alive because humans had chosen to risk everything for strangers. The human ships limped back to Station Volanti 9. Their hulls scarred, their systems damaged, their crews exhausted and injured. Captain Lee and 4 crew members from the Northern Star had died from radiation exposure. 12 other human crew members were in critical condition. Dozens more were injured. Su-min met the ships at the docking bay. She helped carry the wounded to the station's medical facilities. She held the hand of a young engineer named Kim Hae-jin as the doctors fought to save her life. She stood silent and still when they told her that 2 more crew members had not survived. The cost had been terrible, but when Su-min finally left the medical bay and walked back toward the coordination center, she passed through corridors filled with Valkyrie survivors. They looked at her with expressions she had never seen directed at a human before. Not contempt, not dismissal, not amusement, gratitude or respect. A small Valkyrie child, no older than what humans would call 6 years old, broke away from her mother and ran up to Su-min. She pressed something into Su-min's hand, a small crystal pendant that Valkyrie children wore as protective charms. The child's mother caught up and pulled her daughter back. "I am sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "She wanted you to have it. She says the humans are heroes." Su-min looked down at the small crystal in her palm. Then she looked at the child and her mother, at the hundreds of survivors filling the station's corridors, at the lives that had been saved because her species had refused to stand by and do nothing. "Tell her thank you," Su-min said. "Tell her that we were honored to help." Then she continued walking toward the coordination center. There was still work to do. The Grand Assembly Hall was fuller than it had been since the opening ceremonies. Word had spread through the station that something dramatic was about to happen, and delegates from every species had gathered to watch Su-min enter through a side door and made her way to the small platform reserved for minor delegations. She could feel hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. Some looked at her with pity, others with anticipation, a few she noticed with quiet gratitude, looked at her with something like respect. Ambassador Dexoran stood at the central podium, his compound eyes gleaming with barely concealed satisfaction. He had dressed in the formal ceremonial armor of a Velthari senior diplomat, a clear signal that he considered this a matter of grave importance around him. The other Velthari delegates sat in perfect formation. They knew what was coming. The chamber fell silent as Dexoran raised one of his upper limbs' fellow delegates. He began, his voice carrying through the hall with practiced authority. I have called this emergency session to address a serious breach of summit protocol. He turned slowly, making sure every species saw him, building the moment like a performer on a stage over the past several days. The human delegate has been conducting unauthorized negotiations with multiple delegations. She has been meeting in secret, making promises she has no authority to keep, attempting to manipulate the political relationships of species far older and wiser than her own MERS rippled through the chamber. Some delegates nodded in agreement. Others exchanged uncertain glances. This is not the behavior of a legitimate diplomat. Dexoran continued. This is the behavior of a schemer, a manipulator, a creature who seeks to gain advantage through deception rather than honest negotiation. He pointed one limb directly at Su Min. I move that this human's credentials be revoked immediately, and that she be expelled from Station Volanti 9. Furthermore, I move that humanity be denied participation in all future summit activities until they demonstrate they can be trusted to conduct themselves with proper respect for established protocol. The Velthari delegation made sounds of loud approval. Several other delegations joined them. Su Min stood silently, waiting. Dexoran turned to the assembly chairman, an elderly Kellori who had presided over the summit for decades. I call for an immediate vote on this motion. The chairman looked troubled, but nodded slowly. Before we vote, protocol requires that the accused party be given an opportunity to respond. He turned to Su Min, human delegate. Do you wish to address these charges? Su Min stepped forward to the speaking platform. The hall fell silent again, everyone waiting to see how this small creature would try to defend herself. I do, she said, her voice steady. Ambassador Dexoran, it's correct that I have been meeting with various delegations over the past several days. This is true. Dexoran made a clicking sound of triumph. She admits her guilt. I did not conduct secret negotiations. Su Min continued. Ignoring the interruption, I had conversations. I asked questions. I listened to answers. I learned about the needs and concerns of species other than my own. Pause. If this is a crime, then I am guilty. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates she had spoken with over the past days. But I do not believe it is a crime to talk with people. I do not believe it is a crime to listen, and I do not believe it is a crime to look for ways that everyone might benefit. Dexoran's posture shifted, his satisfaction wavering slightly. What are you saying? Human Su Min turned to face him directly. I'm saying that I discovered something during my conversations, something that I believe this assembly should hear. She activated her data display, projecting information into the air above the speaking platform. The Kellori delegation needs a medical compound to treat a plague in their outer colonies. The Thracians have this compound but will not deal with the Kellori directly due to historical grievances. The Thracians need irrigation technology. The Venakai have this technology but cannot acquire the shipping routes they need to deliver it. The Venakai need access to trade routes controlled by the Velthari. Each point appeared as a connection on the display, drawing lines between species who have refused to speak directly to one another for centuries. Every species here wants something. Su Min said every species here has something to offer, but pride and old wounds prevent you from reaching out to each other. What I proposed was not manipulation. It was a bridge. She changed the display to show her exchange proposal. Earth standing at the center as a neutral intermediary connecting all parties. Humanity gains nothing material from this arrangement, she said. We receive no resources, no technology, no territorial concessions. What we gain is far more valuable. The opportunity to be useful, to be trusted, to prove that we belong among you, not because of what we can take, but because of what we can give. The chamber was completely silent. Delegates who had been ready to vote against now looked at the display with new expressions. Several were clearly calculating the benefits such an arrangement might bring their own species. Dexorn recovered quickly. Pretty words from a primitive creature, he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. You cannot simply insert yourself into relationships between elder species. Who are you two? I am no one. Sumin interrupted him. I am a junior delegate from a species that achieved faster than light. Traveled 12 years ago. I have no power here. I have no influence. I have nothing to offer except my willingness to help. She paused, looking around the chamber. You asked what humans gain from this. I will tell you. We gain friends. We gain allies. We gain the chance to show that we are more than primitive creatures, worth only mockery. A voice rose from the upper tiers. Ambassador Yuntai had stood, her blue skin luminous under the chamber lights. I have spoken with the human delegate, she said. Her proposal has merit. The Kalori are willing to participate in this exchange. Murmurs spread through the chamber. A moment later, the Thracian trade minister rose. The Thracians will consider this proposal, she said, her massive form casting shadows across nearby delegates. We have been seeking a solution to our agricultural problems for some time. If this human can provide one without requiring us to compromise our dignity, we will listen one by one. Other delegates stood. The Venekai representative expressed interest in the shipping arrangement. Even a junior Velthari administrator, the same one Su Min had spoken with days earlier, rose to say that the proposal deserved serious consideration. Dexorn looked around the chamber with growing disbelief. His carefully planned destruction of the human delegate was falling apart. Instead of expelling her, the assembly was now seriously discussing her proposal. This is absurd, he snarled. You cannot possibly. Ambassador Dexorn, the chairman interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of his decades of authority. The assembly has heard the human delegate's response. It appears that many delegations wish to explore her proposal rather than vote on your motion. Do you still wish to proceed with your call for expulsion? Dexorn's compound eyes flickered between Sumin and the delegates, who had risen to support her. For a long moment, he stood frozen, his carefully maintained composure cracking before he could respond. A loud chime echoed through the chamber. Every delegate's communication device activated simultaneously, displaying the same emergency alert. The chairman's expression changed from stern to worried as he read the message. He raised one hand for silence. This session is suspended. He announced, we have received word of a crisis in the outer sectors. A Velthari colony ship has been struck by a massive radiation storm. Their engines and shields are disabled. Thousands of lives are at risk. The chamber erupted in chaos. Velthari delegates rushed toward the exits, their concern for their own species overwhelming all political considerations. Other delegations began calculating distances and response times. Dexorn stood frozen for only a moment. Then he turned and ran for the communication center. All thoughts of the human delegate forgotten, but Su Min did not move. She stood at the speaking platform, watching the chaos around her, and began doing calculations of her own. Earth's merchant fleet was small and primitive by galactic standards, but it was fast, and human crews were trained to operate in conditions that would kill most other species. She pulled out her personal communicator and began sending messages if there was any chance that humanity could help. She was going to find it. While the senior delegates conducted their formal negotiations in the Grand Assembly Hall, she wandered the station's corridors and common areas were informal. Conversations happened away from official records. She visited the food Courts where different species gathered to eat there. Native cuisine, she sat in. Observation lounges where tired diplomats came to relax between sessions. She found quiet corners where junior delegates complained about their superiors, and everywhere she went, she paid attention. The galaxy's species were not as united as they pretended to be. Ancient rivalries simmered beneath polite diplomatic language. Resource disputes stretched back centuries. Trade agreements that benefited one species often came at the expense of another. Everyone wanted something that someone else had. But pride in history prevented direct negotiation. Su-Min began mapping these connections in her mind. The Kalori delegation was desperate for medical supplies, specifically a rare compound that their healers needed to treat a plague spreading through their outer colonies. They had plenty of advanced technology to trade, but the species who controlled the compound, the Thracians, would not deal with them directly 300 years ago. The Kalori had sided against the Thracians in a territorial war. The Thracians had long memories. Meanwhile, the Thracians had problems of their own. Their agricultural worlds needed new irrigation technology to cope with changing climate patterns. The Venakai had exactly the technology they needed. But the Venakai wanted something the Thracians could not provide: access to shipping routes controlled by the Velthari. The Velthari, of course, would never grant such access to the Venakai, not after the incident at Korvax Station 50 years ago, and so it went. A tangled web of needs and grudges and wounded pride that kept everyone stuck in place. No one would make the first move, because making the first move meant admitting weakness. Su-Min saw the answer clearly. Someone needed to stand in the middle and connect all the pieces. Without anyone losing face, someone with no ancient enemies. Someone with no territorial claims. Someone so insignificant that dealing with them carried no political cost. Someone exactly like a young human delegate that everyone had already dismissed on the third evening. She approached the Kalori delegation during their informal dining hour. Ambassador Yuntai, the senior Kalori representative, looked up with mild surprise as Su-Min sat down at a nearby table. "You are the human," Yuntai said, her voice carrying a musical quality that Su-Min found pleasant. The one Nexoran humiliated in the assembly. Su-Min nodded. "I am Kang Su-Min. I hope I am not disturbing you." Ambassador Yuntai made a gesture that Su-Min's translator interpreted as curiosity mixed with amusement. Most would have fled the station after such treatment. "Yet you remain. Why?" "Because I did not come here for my pride." Su-Min said, "I came here to help my people, and leaving empty-handed would not serve them." The Kalori ambassador studied her for a long moment. "You remind me of Kalori younglings," she said finally. "Small and fragile, but unwilling to accept defeat. It is not always a virtue. Sometimes it leads to destruction, and sometimes it leads to survival." Su-Min replied. Yuntai made another gesture, this one indicating approval. "What do you want?" Young human Su-Min leaned forward. "Slightly I know about the plague in your outer colonies. I know you need the Thracian compound to synthesize a treatment. And I know the Thracians will not deal with you directly because of what happened at Valor Prime 3 centuries ago." Yuntai's expression shifted to something Su-Min could not read. "You have been busy. I have been listening." Su-Min said, "I also know the Thracians need irrigation technology that the Venakai have. And the Venakai need shipping access that the Velthari control. Everyone wants something. No one will ask for it." Yuntai was silent for a moment. "And what does the human want?" Su-Min smiled. "Nothing for myself. But I believe I can help you get what you need. If you are willing to trust me, that is a great deal to ask from someone we barely know." "I know," Su-Min said, "but you have nothing to lose by listening over the next hour." Su-Min outlined her proposal. Earth would serve as a neutral intermediary for a multi-party exchange. The Thracians would provide the medical compound to Earth. Who would pass it to the Calori? The Calori would provide their advanced scanning technology to Earth. Who would pass it to the Venakai? The Venakai would provide their irrigation systems to Earth. Who would pass them to the Thracians, and the Velthari would grant limited shipping access to routes that pass through human-controlled space, technically making Earth the destination rather than the Venakai. It was complicated and indirect, but it allowed every species to get what they needed. Without dealing directly with their rivals, no one would have to back down. No one would have to admit weakness. The only species that gained nothing material from the arrangement was humanity, and that was exactly the point. What do humans gain from this? Yuntai asked, her tone suspicious, something more valuable than goods. Su Min said, trust relationships, a place at the table. Yuntai considered this. Your species is very strange. We have only been among the stars for 12 years. Su Min said, we learned long ago that the best way to make friends is to be useful. Over the following day, Su Min approached each delegation involved in her proposed exchange. She met with the Thracian trade minister in a private dining room. Speaking calmly about agricultural needs and ancient grievances, she found the Venakai representatives in an engineering bay, admiring the station's power systems, and talked with them about shipping routes and commercial opportunities. She even managed a brief conversation with a junior Velthari administrator who was willing to listen as long as no one important was watching. Each conversation was careful and respectful. Su Min never pushed too hard. She asked questions and listened to answers. She remembered names and small details about each delegate's homeworld. She found common ground wherever she could. Slowly, piece by piece, she built something that had not existed before, a network of species who were willing to consider working together, with humanity as the quiet thread connecting them all. The word of her meetings began to spread on the 5th day of the summit. Su Min noticed delegates watching her with new interest as she moved through the station. Some looked curious, others looked suspicious, and one looked furious. Ambassador Dexoran had learned what the insignificant human was doing behind the scenes. He had connections throughout the station, and nothing happened at the summit without his knowledge. The creature he had publicly humiliated was now conducting secret negotiations with major delegations. She was building alliances right under his nose. To a being like Thexoran, this was not just an annoyance, it was a challenge to his authority, and Velthari did not tolerate challenges from lesser species. He called an emergency session of the full assembly for the following morning. The official reason was to discuss procedural matters. The real reason was to destroy the human once and for all. That night, one of Yungtai's junior assistants found Su Min and warned her what was coming. You should leave. The Calori said, take a ship back to Earth before the morning session. Dexoran will not simply embarrass you this time. He will have your credentials revoked. He will demand that humanity be expelled from the summit permanently. Su Min thanked the assistant for the warning. Then she returned to her quarters and spent the night preparing for the morning. She would not run. She would not hide if Dexoran wanted to confront her in front of the entire assembly. She would be ready. This time, she would not stand alone. Kang Su Min stood at the observation window of Station Volanti 9 and watched ships from 100 different worlds drift past like glowing fish in a dark ocean. She had dreamed of this moment since she was a child, sitting in her grandmother's kitchen in Busan, staring at the stars through a cracked window and wondering if anyone was looking back. Now she knew the answer. The galaxy was full of life, full of ancient civilizations that had been traveling between stars when humans were still learning to make fire, and today she would meet them. Su Min checked her reflection in the polished metal wall, and straightened her collar for the 10th time. She was 28 years old, the youngest member of Earth's diplomatic corps. And this was her first interstellar assignment. The Galactic Trade Summit happened once every standard cycle, bringing together representatives from dozens of species to negotiate commerce treaties and shipping agreements. Humanity had only achieved faster-than-light travel 12 years ago, which made them infants by galactic standards. Most species at the summit had been spacefaring for thousands of years. Some had been traveling the stars for longer than human civilization had existed. Su Min's assignment was modest. She was here to secure a minor shipping agreement for Earth's small merchant fleet. Nothing more. Her supervisors had made it clear that she should observe, learn, and avoid making waves. Do not embarrass humanity, they had told her. We are guests here. She gathered her documents and walked toward the grand assembly hall where the opening ceremonies would take place. The corridors of Station Volante 9 were built for species much larger than humans, and Su Min felt like a child walking through a cathedral. Aliens of every shape and size moved past her, some walking on 2 legs like her, others gliding on multiple limbs or floating in anti-gravity harnesses. A few glanced at her with curiosity. Most ignored her entirely. When she reached the assembly hall, an attendant checked her credentials and directed her to her assigned seating. Su Min's heart sank when she saw the location. She had been placed in the highest tier of the circular chamber, far from the central platform where the important negotiations would take place. From here, she could barely see the main speakers. The message was clear. Humanity was tolerated at this summit, not welcomed. She sat down and watched as the other delegates took their places. The Velthari occupied the positions of honor near the center, their tall insectoid bodies gleaming under the lights. They were one of the oldest spacefaring species and controlled most of the major trade routes in this sector. Their ambassador, a creature called Thexorn, was famous throughout the galaxy for his sharp tongue and sharper political instincts. The Kalori delegation sat nearby, their blue-skinned humanoid forms draped in flowing robes. They were known as healers and scientists, and their medical technology was considered the finest in the known galaxy. Across from them were the Thracians, massive reptilian beings who controlled vast agricultural worlds, and scattered throughout the chamber were dozens of other species, each with their own histories, their own technologies, their own ancient grudges and alliances. Su Min took notes on everything she observed. The opening ceremonies began with speeches from senior ambassadors, each one praising the spirit of cooperation while subtly reminding everyone of their own species' importance. When the formal portion ended, delegates began mingling and conducting informal business. This was Su Min's chance. She made her way down from her isolated seat and approached the nearest group of delegates. They were discussing a shipping dispute, and she waited politely for a pause in their conversation before introducing herself. The aliens looked at her with mild surprise. A human, one of them said, as if identifying an unusual insect. The others made sounds that Su Min's translator rendered as amusement. She pressed forward anyway, explaining that Earth was interested in establishing trade relationships, asking if anyone might be willing to discuss potential agreements. The delegates exchanged glances and then walked away without responding. Su Min tried again with another group and another. Each time, the result was the same: polite dismissal at best, open contempt at worst. By the end of the first day, she had not managed a single meaningful conversation. On the second day, she decided to submit her proposal through official channels. She approached the central platform during the designated period for minor delegations and requested permission to speak. The chamber fell quiet as the other delegates noticed the small human standing alone before them. Ambassador Thexorn leaned forward, his compound eyes glittering with what Su Min's translator interpreted as predatory interest. A human wishes to address the summit, he announced, his voice carrying through the chamber. How delightful. Su Min stood straight and began her prepared speech. Outlining Earth's proposal for a modest shipping agreement, she spoke clearly and professionally, making her case with the facts and figures her team had prepared. She was halfway through when Xoran interrupted her. "Tell me, little human," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness, "does your species always send children to conduct important business? Or is this meant as an insult to us?" Laughter rippled through the chamber. Su Min kept her composure. "I am a fully credentialed representative of Earth." Ambassador Xoran made a clicking sound that her translator rendered as mockery. "Earth," he repeated, as if tasting something unpleasant. "A single world of soft creatures who learned to leave their gravity barely a dozen cycles ago. And now you come here asking for trade agreements as if you were our equals." More laughter. Louder this time, other delegates joined in. Adding their own comments, the Thracian representative noted that humans were barely more than prey animals, evolving as food for larger predators of Velthary trade. Minister observed that human technology was so primitive, it was almost charming. Like watching ancestors play with stone tools. Xoran raised one of his limbs for silence. "Let us be kind," he said, his voice thick with false sympathy. "These creatures cannot help what they are. Perhaps in another 1,000 years, when their species has matured, they might be worthy of our attention. Until then, let us not waste the summit's time with their childish requests." He waved dismissively towards Su Min. "You may return to your seat. Little one, the adults have business to conduct." Su Min stood frozen for a moment as laughter echoed around her. Her face burned with humiliation. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she did not cry. She did not shout. She simply gathered her documents, inclined her head in a formal bow, and walked back to her seat in the highest tier. That night, alone in her quarters, Su Min allowed herself 10 minutes to feel the full weight of her shame. Then she dried her eyes and opened her computer terminal. She began pulling up files on every delegation at the summit. Every species, every ambassador, every dispute and alliance and grudge that had shaped galactic politics for centuries. If they would not listen to her words, she would find another way. She worked through the night, reading and analyzing and taking notes. By morning, she had found something interesting. Several major delegations were locked in a resource dispute that had been stalling negotiations for 3 standard cycles. None of them could resolve it directly because none of them would lose face by backing down. But Su Min saw an angle that none of them had considered, a path that required no one to admit defeat, a solution that only worked if someone from outside their ancient rivalries brought them together. They had called her a child. They had called her primitive. They had dismissed her as unworthy of attention. Now she would show them what humans could do.